Welcome to Handmade Happenings. I'm Marissa, and today I am making a skirt for my niece and trying out a new embroidery pattern while I'm at it. So here I'm cutting out the fabric. This is a simple gathered skirt with like a flat front waistband and elastic in the back. So I'm cutting out 2 skirt pieces, then a front and back waistband piece, as well as 4 rectangles for pockets. And while I do that, I'm going to share kind of the backstory behind this project. So this all started with the embroidery pattern. I bought this pattern because I liked it, and as a result, didn't really have an idea of what I was going to use it for. So my original plan was to make myself a dress with this gray fabric that I had, but it turned out that the design I had in mind, I didn't have enough fabric for. So I ended up turning that into a coat. Then I was going to do the same dress design, but out of this navy blue fabric that I had. And I already had the skirt cut out when someone gave me some gingham fabric, and my plan changed again. So this embroidery pattern is in a style that was originally meant for being done on gingham fabrics because it uses the checks as kind of a grid to indicate where the stitches are going to be. That said, the pattern did have instructions for how to do it on a solid fabric. That's why my original plans involved solid fabrics. However, when it came down to it, the design that I had in mind also wasn't very conducive to this pattern because it did not involve a straight skirt. It involved a quarter circle skirt, so there's a slight curve to it, which is not exactly helpful when you need to draw a grid on your fabric. And so I decided to take that blue fabric that I already had the skirt cut out of and make a dress for one of my nieces, and to use this gingham fabric to make a skirt for the other one. So this embroidery pattern does have multiple kind of, views. You have like one that's meant to go down the front of a bodice, one that's meant to go at the waist, and then one that's just kind of a heart-shaped motif. And my original plan was to take the one that was originally meant for the waist and actually do it all around the hem of the skirt. But then I ran into a problem and ended up changing my plans again. So the pattern says that this is best worked on 1/4 inch gingham, which means that each square would be about 1/4 inch. And the print on this fabric is smaller than that, like less than 1/8 of an inch. And I definitely had no interest in making the embroidery quite that small. I looked at it and I did consider that I could take like a 3 by 3 grid of squares on the fabric and have that be 1 square according to the pattern. But that really just felt like setting myself up for a lot of frustration, so I decided instead to do the heart-shaped motif onto patch pockets and just attach those to the front of the skirt. So for the pockets, I cut out 4 rectangles from a solid fabric, and then I took 2 of them and drew a 1/4 inch grid on them using a heat erase pen. And then it was time to start with the embroidery. Now this is called chicken scratch embroidery. I think there are other names for it, but that's the only one I can remember off the top of my head. And the pattern called for 2 strands of embroidery floss, but I have a whole bunch of what is called floche, which is another thread that you can embroider with that I am trying to use up, so I went ahead and used that. And I started with 2 strands only to realize that that was too thick, and I pulled out what I had done and redid it with just the 1 strand. So the pattern is worked in about 4 steps. The first step is cross stitches, which are done along the squares in the shape of a heart. And actually it's double cross stitches because what you do is you first make an X on the square and then you put basically stitch a plus sign on top of that. And so all of the strands should cross right in the middle, and I found it looked best if I was careful to be very precise and make sure that they actually did cross all in the same spot. However, for the most part, I didn't worry about that too much and just kind of eyed it. I did, however, find this a bit tedious. Basically, the pattern at this point is, it's kind of like a grid, and it marks where you're to place the cross stitches based on the grid, of course, on your fabric. It reminded me actually of cross stitch. And at this point, I kind of wanted to stop just after step 1. I mean, it was a heart shape, so it didn't look bad, and really because of how much work it had been just up to that point. But I didn't, and fortunately, the remaining steps were a lot less work. I think because the cross stitches are almost like the base of the pattern, and then the remaining stitches and steps kind of get woven between and through the threads of the cross stitches. So steps 2 and 3 involved weaving ovals between certain threads of the cross stitches. First by weaving 2 ovals that crossed each other in kind of an X, and then step 3 being doing ovals that were woven all around one cross stitch that created kind of the look of a flower. And step 4 was what the pattern called lace, which was more weaving of threads between cross stitches, this time in more of a diamond shape. Once the embroidery was done, I ironed it to erase the grid, and then took the 2 rectangles and placed them down on top of the remaining 2 pocket rectangles with the embroidery facing down. I then sewed these pieces together around all the edges, and leaving a hole at the bottom so that I could flip them right sides out. Then I top stitched that top edge. Now I am positioning the pockets onto the front skirt piece, trying to kind of get them kind of even between from the center front and the side seams. And then I sewed them on along the 3 edges, leaving that top edge obviously unsewn. And when I did this also closed that hole at the bottom of the pockets that had been left open to turn them right side out. To assemble the skirt, I sewed the front and back pieces together along the side seams. I did the same for the waistband as well, and then I took it and I folded it in half, lining up those raw edges, and pressed it into place to get that crease right in the center of the waistband. I gathered and pinned the skirt front to the front waistband, making sure to only pin it to one layer of the waistband. And then I also pinned the back skirt to the back waistband as well, though that part did not need gathered because it's actually the same width as the waistband. After sewing the skirt to the waistband, I took the other half of the back waistband and folded it down, then turned under the raw edge and stitched it in place. I then went back and added another line of stitching halfway between that first line and the edge of the waistband. This to create channels for the elastic. And that's just because I didn't have a piece of elastic that was wide enough to fit the waistband, so I was using 2 pieces instead. So I cut 2 pieces of elastic to the length of the front waistband and threaded one into each of those channels, pinning the edges in place with the edge of the back waistband. I then folded down and turned under the front waistband just like I did for the back, and I went back to the sewing machine. And what I did here was I started by sewing at that side seam of the waistband up and down, which caught the elastic on one end. I then turned the skirt and sewed along the front waistband, and then turned it again and sewed up and down the other side seam of the waistband, catching that other end of the elastic. And the last step was just to turn up and sew the hem. And here is the finished skirt. As I was making this, I kept thinking how nice this would look as an apron. And since I have extra fabric left over, I might just have to make one for myself. As always, thank you so much for watching, and I hope you will join me next week for another handmade happening.